Welcome to the Mad in America podcast, your source for science, psychiatry, and social justice.
Welcome to the Mad in America podcast. This is science news writer Tim Beck, and I will be interviewing Ian Tucker, professor and director of impact and innovation in the School of Psychology at University of East London. He has expertise in digital media, emotion and mental health, and has published over 45 articles and book chapters, and has a monograph book entitled The Social Psychology of Emotion. He is currently authoring an Emotion in the Digital Age monograph for Routledge's Studies in Science, Technology, and Society series, while working on several projects involving technology and mental health. So welcome, Ian. It's great to talk to you today.
Thanks very much. Great to be here.
Just to get started, I noticed you have a really broad range of transdisciplinary research interests. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit of information about your background. So do you have a PhD in psychology, philosophy, social theory, mental health? What's your background there?
My background's in psychology. I did an undergraduate degree in psychology, and then I did a PhD in psychology as well. I think the kind of interdisciplinarity of it and the kind of transdisciplinarity of it comes from probably mostly from my PhD work. So I did my PhD in the early 2000s at Loughborough University. And it's a really interesting place at the time because there was a group, you may well have heard, there's a group of people in the kind of social sciences there who had developed a kind of an approach to studying psychology as interaction, kind of known as discourse analysis, right. Really kind of well known. But in a slightly different department, where there was also a psychology element, there was a group of us working with, I was supervised by Professor Steve Brown, there was Professor John Crombie there. We were kind of really interested in psychology as a kind of embodied material kind of experience. So in a sense, although I'd been trained in psychology and I'd done all the kind of, cognitive psychology and neuropsychology and all those things as an undergraduate, it was very much the social elements of psychology that I was interested in. Right. And kind of studying psychology, in the environments in which it's experienced. Yeah. So if you like, it's almost kind of a slightly sort of expanded view of psychology, fully acknowledging there's stuff going on in the mind, but also really interested in how people experience, people's psychological experiences as kind of materially embodied, grounded experiences.
There's such a rich history of that line of thinking in the UK, so it makes sense that you have those connections with the discourse analytic tradition.
Yeah, and I mean they were really, really influential, and I did a lot of that kind of discourse analytic work in my PhD, but then almost this kind of broadened it in terms of this kind of the materiality aspects, I think, as well, which maybe that wasn't. There were debates at the time about how that language can do a lot, and it does a lot of work kind of psychologically, but what about kind of the material environment and kind of the body and these more kind of, sometimes sort of ineffable kind of elements and stuff, how do you potentially kind of incorporate them? And I think that's where some of the kind of philosophy potentially kind of comes in a bit.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Yeah, so a lot of your research interests focus on the relationship between emotions and technology and mental health and technology. This interest in mental health and technology, is this an interest that you've always had? Is this something that comes from any work that you've done in the mental health field, or is this maybe just something that came about naturally during your PhD?
Well, the technology thing's more recent, so I'll start with the mental health. The mental health sort of strand, I think, has been the main kind of empirical strand in my work since my PhD. I mean, and I think that's possibly comes from kind of two places. One of which is my late father was a psychiatric nurse, and I don't know if you know in the UK. Well, it would have been the same in the States as well. But we used to have these grand kind of Victorian mental health asylums out in the countryside. My father worked in one of them, and he used to take me up there. You could just freely access those at that time. And it was a really kind of evocative experience as a young child, walking around this huge building. And I can still, remember the sights and the smells of the environment there. So I think I'd sort of had an interest in mental health from an early age. And then as an undergraduate, I did a final year module that was run by Professor Paula Reevey. She's done a lot of work in kind of mental health and the environment as well. And it was a really good kind of critical take on sort of mental health that raised quite a few issues around debates around how we conceptualize mental distress and the issues around kind of diagnosis and medicalization and things. So that's been there kind of throughout my kind of PhD, and that's been an empirical strand for quite some time. As I say, for me, experiences of mental distress are ongoing. They don't just happen in the clinic or in the mental health services. They're also there with people as they just go through everyday life. So I was also interested in that kind of everyday life kind of aspect of it. Where were people experiencing distress, and how were their experiences of distress shaped by the kind of places they inhabit and the environments in which they inhabit. So I've done empirical work, the impact of kind of community centres on kind of notions of recovery. I've done work on people's experience of their kind of home environments and kind of organising and managing their home kind of spaces in relation to distress. I've done work in kind of forensic, secure settings as well. I think what the technology is probably emerged more in the last 4, 5, 6 years, where my interest in kind of the environments and the locations of experience of distress became quite apparent that they're becoming increasingly kind of digitized. So almost to focus on environments without focusing on how they're increasingly mediated by digital technology seems something, it seems an interesting area and an important area to start to look at.
Yeah, that makes so much sense to me, because I think about my own work. I think back to where this started, and this was like reading the antipsychiatrists like Foucault and Bisaglia, and like they've always had this interest on how institutions can regulate the emotions of the patients who are there, right? Yeah. And it's not just the thoughts that become institutionalized, but people's emotions become institutionalized and their bodies become disciplined in the way that Foucault talk about them. But with deinstitutionalization, then things open up, right? And things go out into the community. And it would make sense that we would see uses of digital technology in those areas to sort of expand the reach of that a little bit. So is that where you came from it as well?
Yeah, no, definitely. I remember, reading the Bisaglia stuff, Foucault's Madness of Civilization, and just mental health, is such a, unfortunately, it's been such a kind of rich kind of resource for studies of cultural theory and because it's been subject to so many kind of different kind of conceptualizations throughout the years, and like you say, the kind of the deinstitutionalization, the moving to community care, which was deemed to be a way of integrating people more into kind of communities, because keeping them institutionalized sort of out in these kind of out of town places, it was like they were kind of removed, and that was an othering process. And it's felt, well, we just bring them back to the community, then that will be okay. And of course, it wasn't. So it became a real interest to sort of see, what does community care mean for people? Where is it located? The location of mental health care was so prominent when it was in the institutions, because it was so kind of spatialized in these big, huge kind of Victorian institutions. Right. Whereas where were the locations in kind of community care? And that's what I was interested in doing. And like, what does it mean then for digital technologies to be increasingly used in mental health services and stuff, and how does that change the operation and kind of way that community care kind of works, basically?
Right. Yeah. And so I've noticed that in your work you focus a lot on a few particular French philosophers, like Guy Deleuze and Gilbert Simondon, Henri Bergson. I'm just curious, is there anything about their thought in particular that you found useful for thinking about these issues, or have you just sort of stumbled across them through their connections with each other?
A bit of both, probably. This always stuck with me. When I was sort of halfway through my PhD, I'd interviewed many people using mental health services in the Midlands and the UK, because that's where I was doing the PhD. I was interviewing them in community centres, but also talking to them about the other spaces in which they spend their time. So talking about their kind of homes and stuff. And they were talking to me about their homes and how they organised it and what they did there. We were talking through this, I remember one day with my supervisor at the time. He basically introduced this notion of territorialization. Deleuze and Guattari goes, territorialization about kind of the organisation of space. Now, of course, Deleuze and Guattari were doing a bigger thing with it, but it still felt useful as a kind of concept to think about this notion of, space isn't fixed. It's something that requires an ongoing kind of process of kind of ordering, between people and objects and the material kind of environment. That was my way into kind of Deleuze, and then obviously I read around that, and the overarching ideas around kind of process, I think, spoke quite a lot to me, as they still do actually, in the kind of process philosophical ideas and kind of the way that frames experience as this kind of, as an ongoing thing, something that needs to be continually enacted and achieved, rather than trying to reduce particular behaviors or experiences to a computational model of the mind or something. I think that the kind of process was really interesting in terms of Deleuze and Bergson. I like the stuff that Bergson writes around the body as this kind of image and how we can know our bodies in relation to kind of other bodies, and our bodies is the only one we kind of know as a kind of subject rather than just as an object. It's a particular kind of image for us, and that was of interest in relation to how people talk about their bodies in relation to medication, how they try to make sense of the material impacts of medication. I've written some stuff around kind of medication and experience of medication. So I was really interested in that. And then the Simondon thing is, I think, a continuation of that. But Simondon had a particular focus on technology, which I found kind of really interesting. And also this idea of the psychological experience depending on this relationship to ourselves and our relationship to others, but that this is happening kind of simultaneously. So there's this notion of kind of psychic and collective individuation, that we are simultaneously individual and collective. We're kind of carrying a part of the collective with us. And I think what that resonated with me in terms of data, basically, and data practices, this idea that we are, as we interact with digital technologies, we are constantly kind of adding to the collective as we generate data, or the technologies we engage with generate data about our activities, that this is feeding into the algorithms of big tech, etc. Broadly speaking, I've found process philosophies a rich resource for understanding the kind of sort of experience of mental health and emotion. And then there have been particular kind of concepts used by the likes of Deleuze, Simondon, and Bergson that I found useful in relation to specific kind of research questions in particular projects.
I've had the same thought with Simondon, because you have the biopsychosocial model in psychology, which is quickly becoming one of the most popular. And the way that I feel like it tends to be talked about is that these are sort of separate realms that somehow interact in this way that we don't really understand. But Simondon does this great job, like you said, is talking about how these processes of individuation, they can happen simultaneously. And by focusing on one, we kind of ignore the implications of the other. And I think his thought for me was always such an interesting way of combining these different areas without reducing any one to any of the other areas.
Yeah, and the idea that we're so conditioned to think of the individual and start our analysis in terms of the individual, and how does, certainly in psychology, how does the individual work? But someone wants to take us back from that, because you don't start with the individual, you start with the kind of process, that collective kind of trans individuation, the kind of process before an individual has kind of emerged, and then you try to understand that kind of process of emergence. So it's that kind of stepping back, I think, is really, really useful, which isn't something we always do in psychology, I think, because often we are very focused on the individual, and that's our starting point. How does this particular psychological kind of phenomenon operate?
There's been a lot of discussion on Mad in America lately about all these new applications of digital technology to issues related to mental health and distress. And so there's been a lot of talk about the FDA, for instance, recently approving like this version of digital pill, which contains sensors that detect, when they've been ingested, and courts and various authorities can track this. There are new apps being released all the time that track the mental health of their users, collecting data on their activity and sometimes even their physiology and biology. Then there's the exceedingly popular virtual therapy apps like Talkspace that are being used with great popularity now with social distancing guidelines. And then, of course, with all of this, there are applications of artificial intelligence to making diagnoses and suggesting treatments. So the question that I wanted to ask you from your perspective, like, what do you see as some of the most concerning ways that the digital technologies are being used in these ways, in professional mental health relationships in particular?
Wow. As you articulated really well there, so it's a really kind of huge area, and I think there's many things that need to be considered in relation to this. And I don't know, I know the UK context obviously better than I know the US context. Firstly, I think often these things are being driven by commercial organisations. And you've only got to go on the App Store and you can find 10,000 mental health related apps or whatever. But very few, certainly in the UK, very few are authorized and kind of regulated by our National Health Service, because to get something regulated by the National Health Service, there's a whole kind of process it needs to go through, and it needs to kind of randomized control trials or that are seen as the gold standard of kind of testing. So there's not much kind of official, but there's so much kind of unofficial kind of out there. But it's almost as if the regulators can't keep up because things are coming out so quickly. One of my concerns is actually how these technologies are used by kind of professional health services and in relation to professional mental health services. So, for example, are they used as a supplement, or are they increasingly used in place of in-person kind of care and support? So I think they can be really helpful if it's as a supplement, but obviously have concerns if it then becomes, something that's actually thought, well, actually we no longer need the in-person services. I mean, all this is a really dynamic situation. None of these, we don't have answers to any of these things yet, but this is the sort of stuff that's being played out. Obviously, as you alluded to at the start, digital technology, that's a really broad range of ways they're being used. I don't know too much about the kind of digital pill thing. That, my immediate reaction to that is obviously who's in charge of the data, how's the data being used, is it safe physiologically? Also, what kind of model of mental health and distress is underpinning that? So it's the idea that the body, what we need to know is the physiology of the body to understand, how people are kind of feeling. And of course, body plays a major role, and so does physiology. But there's also a whole realm of social and kind of cultural inferences around people's feelings of distress. I mean, there's a whole literature on, the impact of trauma and negative life experiences and the correlations with that and developing mental problems. So we have to think about which kind of model of kind of mental health, and it's very much a kind of medical model, an individualistic model or not, that's being used. There are other areas in which they're being used, and in particularly in relation to kind of peer support. That I think, that's often happening in kind of non-clinical settings and non-kind of formal mental health settings, maybe in the sort of charity sector. That can be particularly useful because, we know that developing feelings of belonging and connecting with people that have got similar experiences can be really beneficial. There can be challenges with it as well, but they can be really beneficial. And obviously, one of technology's greatest things is its power to connect. So, it can be beneficial there, but it's such a kind of huge area. I think it's almost needs to be categorized into different areas, and each one kind of judged on its own merits, really, in terms of what's the underlying model of mental health that it's drawn on, who's in charge of it, how is the data being used, will it change individuals' relationship with in-person services? Crucially, amongst all of this, how do individuals feel and experience these new developments? I mean, I've always wanted to talk to people that experience mental health problems and see from their perspective their experiences and see great value in people's own experiences and focusing research on their own experiences.
Seems like you're saying that maybe on the one hand, one of the issues is just the collection of the data, like how's the data being collected and stored, who has access to that data. Yeah. And that's an important issue because as more and more data gets collected, it's going to be harder to just probably keep track of where this data is going and where it's being managed, right? But then on the other hand, and maybe this speaks to some of your theoretical interests and research interests a little bit more, it's like, well, how do we interpret that data? Like what model are we applying to that data? Because you can collect all the data in the world, but if you don't have a way of making sense of all of that data, then it's hard to know where to start or even if it's useful. And it's probably going to be the people who have the means of making sense of the most of that data that can benefit from it the most.
Yeah.
Right? Like which requires probably pretty complex algorithms that not a lot of people have access to.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, it's the model of underpinning the data collection or the data generation, actually. I prefer to talk about kind of data being generated rather than kind of collect. There's a different kind of theoretical kind of premise on there. And then what it's used for. Just to pick up on the point about AI, I mean, there's a real push towards that. You've got virtual chatbots that almost try to emulate the individual kind of therapist kind of relationship. And, there's huge potential there. I think people see huge potential in that because obviously it'd be much more cost effective and much cheaper to deliver services in relation to that. But huge questions regarding whether people feel that can develop a kind of empathetic kind of relationship with a kind of virtual agent. I mean, I did do a project on empathy and artificial intelligence in relation to mental health. It did not involve developing any particular technology, so it was more about exploring the potential to develop a chatbot that would utilize peer support that would be premised on the principles of peer support, but instead of interacting with a peer, you would be interacting with a AI agent that's been trained in the principles of peer support. So a complex project, interesting project. It was very much about working. We ran some workshops and we worked with people who had experienced mental distress to try to understand what they felt about this. And some people were really kind of keen on it and felt that you could, develop a empathetic kind of relationship with an agent, a virtual agent. But there are certain things that they felt would be important to do that, like, that you could personalize it so it felt more kind of individual to you, that you could engage in a kind of conversation with it. So it would need to be kind of trained as a kind of conversation. It would be beneficial. The immediacy of it would be really beneficial. So if you need support, at 3 o'clock in the morning, you can just clock on there. That maybe it would learn, a key finding that came through was that what would be beneficial if it learned what worked for you, so it's almost like have a sort of diary element. But then people also had concerns about it. They felt maybe it would work as a kind of supplemental thing, and also that it would be limited. The idea that it could respond to everything and all the kind of complexity and nuance of experience and emotion, that it would be able to be trained to respond to all of that into a similar way that a trained therapist would be, was questioned. But that's definitely, a significant area of research developing, the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning.
Yeah, and I'm thinking now with the social distancing guidelines that have been imposed, in all areas of the world, recently, there are already reports coming out that more and more people are downloading mental health apps and turning to apps, even ones that don't have another person on the other side, in order to get some, like you said, this immediacy of connection. And even if it's not connection with the person, it creates the feeling of connection. I wonder, sort of moving forward, even maybe after these social distancing guidelines ease a little bit, where do you see this going? Do you think the use of mental health apps is just going to continue to increase? Do you see this idea of interacting with an interface that might not necessarily be a human on the other side is coming to kind of replace other forms of therapy? Because that seemed to be one of the concerns you mentioned before, right? That these are coming out so quickly that no one can really track what they're doing and get any sense for, on the one hand, are they useful? Can they actually help people? On the other hand, who's behind these? Who's benefiting from the data that's being generated via these interactions, right? So what are your senses about where this could go in the future?
It's definitely only going to increase as far as I can tell. Yeah, I mean, obviously, the technology always develops in all areas. So I can only see this increasing. I think the development in terms of the quantity of kind of mental health related apps won't diminish so long as people are using them. I think people do use them a lot. I think an important distinction here, though, is that's not always clear. Is there's lots of mental health related apps. A lot of them are kind of more focused on kind of well-being. Yeah, I know these are slightly problematic concepts, but on kind of well-being, as opposed to helping people with existing mental distress and who are experiencing mental ill health. So there is a distinction there. So I mean, in the US, obviously it'd be the FDA, but in the UK it'd be the NHS, the National Health Service, are doing more research about these apps. I think certain ones will be kind of regulated. There are a few already. There's a kind of website app in the UK called Big White Wall. I think it may well be international. So you might have it in the States. That you can have kind of online therapy with, that has a kind of chat room in it and stuff. And the NHS are supportive and kind of regulate that. And they will start doing research on it. They'll start doing kind of gold standard randomized control trials. That aspect of it, that just takes time, because doing those kind of trials does take a long time. So I think we may well still, this sort of proliferation of mental health related apps that you can have access to, that anyone with a smartphone can have access to, will continue. I don't think they will all become part of formal mental health services, because there's always going to be a lag there until a mental health service will kind of authorize them. The ones that are deemed to be effective, over time, if therapy or whatever aspect of kind of care and support an app focuses on, if it's deemed to be effective, then it could well, there's a real possibility that it'll end up in kind of reducing the provision of that aspect if it was previously supplied through in-person services. Right. I just think that's just a logical way forward. In the same way that many industries are using automation. Automation has happened in many kind of industries, not that mental health is an industry, but, if automation is deemed to be effective, then it will be used. And I think there are real kind of concerns about that. But it's something that just needs ongoing research and kind of, ethical kind of oversight. But as I said before, I can see a lot more use of machine learning and artificial intelligence to provide mental health support.
Yeah, it seems like one of the big concerns is, and it seems like you have a strong, publicly funded health system in the UK. Not so much in the US, unfortunately.
Yeah, they're very different models, aren't they? Yeah.
Very different, yeah. And we've had to deal, with corporate influence in the mental health field since the beginning. It seems like you haven't had those same issues with the pharmaceutical industry and other companies intervening, but it seems like maybe this could open the door for some private interests to make a stake in the mental health market in the UK, or is that a mischaracterization?
No, not necessarily. It's not my area of research, but the link between industry and kind of mental health care in publicly funded NHS goes back quite some time. I mean, people have, the antipsychiatrists written a lot about, the medicalisation of distress, and there's lots of work in kind of critical psychiatry and antipsychiatry about the influence of big pharma. So there are people that would say there has been a link and influence, but I could see that, I think that will continue because in the main, the technology companies aren't, the NHS, for example, doesn't have its own technology development company. It's going to recruit and work in partnership with technology companies who are seeking to develop these things. And these technology companies are largely commercial enterprises. But then in a way, that's no different to the pharmaceutical companies who have been, for the last 70, 80 years have been, talking to the health services and saying, look, we've developed this medication, this can help you in X, Y, and Z. I don't see that much of a difference there. I don't think it's a new thing, although working, now we're maybe not talking about, a medication, we'll be talking about an app or something, but there are key similarities there, I think.
And that leads me to something else I wanted to ask you about. There's been a lot of talk recently about these ideas like surveillance capitalism and digital capitalism and attention economy, right? All these terms get thrown out to try to make sense of really what a lot of other authors have been talking about as the neoliberalization of the market and neoliberalization of the world and of digital technology. So I'm just curious, like with all of these ways of talking about it, do you have a particular frame that you use to make sense of it? I saw one of your studies does talk about surveillance society. Is that something that draws on Zuboff's concept of surveillance capitalism, or are you taking it in a different direction?
Not so much Zuboff's concept, although I have done some work on kind of surveillance, not specifically in relation to mental health. And we, and actually at that point, we were interested in, how people were experiencing kind of surveillance. At that time, it was very much around kind of visual surveillance, actually, more than the kind of what's known as kind of data surveillance or digital surveillance. Or there's a concept of kind of affective atmospheres in sort of social geography and cultural theory and the social science and stuff that we used in terms of trying to kind of understand the fluidity and the kind of complexity of how surveillance can kind of be experienced by people in their kind of as they go through their everyday lives. So we've just finished, I mean, you mentioned it right at the start, we've just finished a book on emotion in a digital age that's due out later this year. In that, we did write about the challenges around this kind of mass datafication of emotion. We were talking particularly kind of about emotion, not only mental health, we do touch on kind of emotional distress and mental health in the book, and actually what that kind of means. And I think, I mean, it's such an issue in contemporary society and the kind of, on a kind of global scale at the moment. But there's still so much we don't know, I think, about how people experience it, what people know about. The use of face recognition has been in the press recently, quite a lot. And then that's not, I mean, we were writing about it in terms of emotion and it's been impressed not just in relation to emotion, it's often in terms of kind of how it's used by law enforcement. But, there's lots of the use of kind of face recognition and AI to try to identify and interpret emotion by commercial enterprises, but a lot of it's quite problematic. It goes back to this idea of, being able to read emotion on the face, and we know that there's a lot of debate about the kind of validity of the studies upon which some of those are developed. And and the universality of emotion, whether that's actually a valid kind of idea that emotion is universally expressed. And actually, even if emotions, obviously we do express emotions through our bodies, but that's only one layer of an emotional experience. But it's happening a lot. Piccadilly Circus in London, UK, they have face recognition technologies that try to pick up what they sense people are feeling and try to use them. It's very much, this is always the trope that's used, but it's very much that kind of Minority Report kind of idea. Right. I just don't know how much people realise it's happening. I've got a PhD student that's kind of trying to work on a project in relation to that to try to see how people feel about it. But it's a huge thing. But I think there's quite a lag in terms of people's awareness and understanding of it.
Yeah, and I think you bring up such a great point about the concept of emotion and how that's traditionally been such an X factor in the history of psychology and psychiatry. There's been so many attempts to try to understand it, and drawing on psychoanalysis, this has been the basis for thinking about the unconscious and that that which we can't really understand. So I think with, like you mentioned, all of the global unrest, the collective activism that's happening against racial injustice, and one of the main issues there seems to be this breakdown in one person's ability to read the other person's emotion, and this reacting on the basis of fear and an assumed threat without knowing if without looking into whether or not there's an actual threat, right? So I think you started speaking to this idea that, well, it's not just going to be police officers that make these inferences, but that there could be technology throughout our public spaces that there could be either someone on the other end making these interpretations, who's a threat and who's not, or algorithms.
It's algorithms. I mean, there are very prominent commercial organisations that have been spun out of academic institutions and research institutions, very much looking at this, building huge databases of images that they then sell to commercial organisations. It's the gold, isn't it, for commercial organisations? Do they know how you feel? Right. If they know how you feel about a product, that's what they need, isn't it? That and that's what they want, and they'll pay a lot of money for it. So the interaction between technology and emotion, I think, is only going to increase.
And it's such a long attempt in psychology to avoid talking about emotion or theorizing it seriously because it's so difficult to understand. It's such an uncertain element. So I think that's one of the reasons I think your work is so interesting. And I think it speaks to something that you have to go to philosophy in order to find frameworks that are helpful to make sense of these issues.
Yeah, I think so. And maybe that's one of the reasons why there's been a real move in kind of affect studies sort of since the late 90s across the kind of social sciences and kind of cultural theory, and a real kind of focus on kind of emotion and affect. Obviously, you can debate a lot about the specific definitions of those terms. One of the things we wrote about in the book, and that comes through really strongly, I think, is also this idea that technologies can know emotions better than the human, that the human just gets in the way of it. So that you need technology, not just that technologies can do what a human can do, but actually that technologies can do what a human can't do. And you need to remove the kind of consciousness out of it. Yeah. And what I mean by that is, that you can develop an algorithm that can identify emotion through a level of micro expression and patterns of micro expressions far better than the human eye. And that's often what these new technologies are saying they can do, and this goes back to the problem in early psychology where some of the people doing the introspection as a kind of method. It was like, well, no, we don't, you've got to take out the self-report, because the self-report isn't valid because it's self-report. The technology, the physiology, the technology can identify the physiological aspects more, and that's where the true phenomena is. And that's happening now. That's happening now with these technologies that are deemed to be better. So you don't ask people how they feel. You use this technology to analyze their micro expressions, and that technology will tell you.
We talked a little bit about the dangers with mental health, but it seems like a lot of dangers using technology for mental health issues. But it seems like a lot of your work also focuses on creating community and the collective dimension that's offered by technology. And that's another thing that drew me to your work. So I'm curious, maybe just to continue this thread a little bit, like, do you have much thoughts on how digital technology has been used within some of these social movements to create this sense of solidarity and to provide a sense of belonging for groups that have traditionally been marginalized?
Okay, yeah. So that's a really good question, and kind of thanks for the opportunity to speak to that, because I think as with any phenomenon, like we talk for technology, we have to obviously make sure we don't homogenize it and suggest it's only one thing, because there are a lot of positives to technology, although I identify some of the problems. In terms of mental health, I've done a project with it wasn't an app at the time, actually. It was just a online community called Friends that was run by one of the major UK mental health charities, which is called Mind. This is a few years ago now, and they had already identified the importance of peer support. People who are effectively doing peer support on their Facebook page at the time, and then so they developed this specialist kind of peer support site, and we looked at how peer support worked, and we interviewed people that used it. As ever, there were kind of pros and cons, but people found the immediacy of it really helpful. They found the anonymity of it quite helpful as well. Yeah, so being able to just talk anonymously about their experiences, being able to, peer support often works because it's that idea that the person you're talking to has had similar experiences, which isn't always a feeling that you'd get when you're dealing with a mental health professional. Yeah, so the value of that sharing of experience, and of course, the advantage of something like an online community is that it gives you access to a far greater number of people that might have had a similar experience than it would within a small kind of community centre that might have 20 people accessing it. When Friends are maybe 200,000. There's several kind of moves towards using kind of technologies to bring people together, and for people to connect, and where notions of proximity and distance aren't then an obstacle to support. So there are benefits to that. There are also kind of challenges to that. I was going to just talk a little bit as well about a project I'm hoping that will be starting soon, hopefully, which is also around kind of community, and actually has a particular kind of COVID-19 related element now, although it didn't when we designed it. We have a series of kind of government publicly funded research councils, and one of these research councils is focused on social science research, and it funded a number of networks to look at mental health, and one of these networks looks at the impact of community and cultural assets on mental health. Many different things can be a community and cultural asset. It might be a local choir. It could be a walking group. It could be a painting group. Any community kind of activity. And they were really interested in understanding the impact of these community assets, as they call them. But there was no element of digital in any of this, So, we're proposing a project to look at the impact of the digital in relation to kind of community assets, and whether it enhances the benefits of these community practices, what the challenges are, whether using digital technology in relation to a community asset, enhances those positive feelings of connection and belonging, whether it acts as an obstacle to them. And we're looking at we hope to look at a couple of kind of groups in relation to that. And then actually, as we were putting the bid together, obviously COVID-19 happened. And now, two of the groups we're going to look at who didn't really use digital technology before have had to go completely online. So what does that mean? Can you deliver these community assets purely online? So there's a number of different ways I think that digital technologies have been used in relation to kind of communities, and that's formal and informal. So that can be a local creative painting group or singing group or something that has its own website that's quite formal. But it can also be, and I think this is really important and doesn't always get included, it could also be maybe a few users of that group who then set up a WhatsApp chat, and what happens in that kind of WhatsApp chat. So I think there are formal and informal uses of digital technology, and I'm interested in kind of both of those aspects. And the more kind of informal ones, I think, don't always get included because maybe they're not so visible, But then that's why I think it's important to talk to the users of these kind of community groups and things, and see how they're using kind of digital technologies.
I know in the history of digital technology studies and the history of the internet, there's a strong undercurrent of peer-to-peer movement where, you're using technology not in a centralized way to collect as much data as possible, like we see with Google and Facebook, but you try to develop these distributed systems or decentralized systems that can, network people in ways that allow resources to be shared more efficiently. And this seemed to be like the grand vision that the internet was built on. So, but now with blockchain and other cryptos, these are like the distributed systems that get all the attention. But there are a lot of people doing interesting projects under the radar to create ways of sharing information and sharing resources more effectively than a centralized system can, right? So I like this way of modeling that mental health on something like that.
Yeah, and I think you touched a really good point there, actually. And obviously technology is used in many different ways, but often the focus is on the delivery of kind of psychological therapies in a digital form. So getting an app that you can have cognitive behavioral therapy through or something. Yeah. So a very kind of clinical focus, and that's obviously often what the mental health services and the professional services are focused on. But then you also get the use of digital technologies by non-mental health services, non-professional kind of services, that might just use websites, but charities might have websites or even have their own Facebook groups. So that's outside of clinical services and might not be focused on the delivery of therapies, but could still be supportive. And then you can also have just much more informal, networks of individuals using community services, that are just talking through WhatsApp or even just texting or something. Yeah. And for me, this is all the use of digital technologies to connect in relation to mental health, but in very different kind of ways. So I think that's an important distinction to make there, actually, that, that doesn't always get picked up on, because very often it's the formal clinical use of digital technologies, that's focused on, rather than all this other stuff that happens as well.
Yeah, and it seems like in that context, then maybe you can think of affect as sort of like the glue that holds that group together, that community together. And maybe this kind of reminds me of maybe your interest in Simon Dinn and Deleuze and affect theory, right? This idea that affect isn't just this individual thing, but it's a public thing that links us together. And in that sense, it's a sort of resource, right? It's a resource that you sometimes have to pay a therapist in order to regulate your emotions for you, right? But this idea is that you're looking at it from the way that it's generated within the community rather than provided as a service.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And and it's much more that kind of the way that affect gets kind of used and kind of, act as a kind of sort of social adhesive and bring people together. As you're talking there, it reminds me of something we wrote around how people talk about how people try to seek support through technology. So this was in relation to Ellie Friends, the online community, about their problems they're having with medication. When they have a new medication or their dosage is increased or something, and they are having these different kinds of feelings, and there's a set of challenges to try to seek support for that. One of which is you might be having these feelings at 3:00 in the morning when you can't access your mental health services. Two of which is the mental health services, even if you could access them, wouldn't have had this medication themselves. So you want to speak to other people that have had it. And then three is, how do you describe these feelings, these embodied kind of feelings? And and that was what I found Bergson quite useful for, this idea of that how do you try to communicate this embodied kind of feelings of different things, but that actually that you kind of could, or you could do it in such a way that would facilitate some kind of support, because the digital technology gave you access to a large number of people that may well have had that particular medication. Oh yeah, I've had that. I actually found it expected me in this and that way. And just actually hearing those stories from other people could be really supportive.
It struck me the way that I was reading that paper when I was reviewing it for Mad in America is that it seems like you're talking about it as creating this sense of a collective knowledge on the site. And so as more users log on and share what's going on for them, it continues to grow and it continues to provide different perspectives on use of medication, which isn't something you usually get when you just go to a doctor and get a prescription. You get the doctor's perspective, but you don't get to hear from other people who've taken that medication to know how they've responded to it.
Yeah, and then it almost becomes like an archive, almost like an archive of effect, if you like, which is something that the digital provides that you wouldn't get necessarily through face-to-face peer support, because that wouldn't necessarily create a record, whereas because it's online, it gets sort of stored. Other people can go on there and see it, so people, and that's what people would say, they would sometimes go on there. There's an interesting kind of temporality, of course, about this, isn't it? Where you can go on there, look for support about something and maybe find a post from 5 years ago, but that speaks directly to your experience. So the support doesn't even have to always be synchronous. It can be asynchronous. And actually, that can be a key advantage of the digital technology because it can create this archive.
I know you talked before about how you're working currently on a book about emotion in the digital age.
Yeah, so we wrote a book with Darren Ellis, a colleague of mine at University of East London. We wrote a book on the social psychology of emotion in 2015. And that first book ended with a kind of chapter on kind of digital emotion, sort of digital related kind of aspects of emotion. So then we developed from that. We've written a book on emotion in the digital age. Obviously, it's highly selective because it's such a big kind of area. But we were keen to look at uses of kind of artificial intelligence in relation to emotion, which has been termed by some people emotional AI. We did a chapter on kind of social media and emotion, a chapter on kind of mental health and emotion, and a chapter on surveillance. That was the kind of final chapter, I think, because the slight danger, I think, with surveillance is that if you start talking about it too early, it can become an all-encompassing kind of concept, and it sort of tells you everything and yet nothing. There's a slight simplification, but I think it was useful to kind of build up to that rather than kind of just go in with surveillance as a kind of concept. So we sort of drawing through different kind of aspects of emotion in relation to kind of technologies. So that's an area that definitely an area kind of an ongoing kind of area of interest.
Okay, great. That's about all the time we have, but it was really great talking to you, Ian. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day to answer some of these questions. It's a great conversation. I appreciated.
No problem, Tim. I really, really enjoyed it, and thanks very much for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Mad in America podcast. Visit madinamerica.com for more news, views, and updates.